Every culture has its legendary weapon, the sword in the stone, the hammer of a god, a blade impossible to break. And for centuries we were told they were just stories, fantasy to fill myths and poems. But then archaeologists began to unearth them, real blades, with an edge, engineering, and secrets that should not have existed for their time. Today you are going to discover 7 legendary weapons that turned out to be completely real. And stay until number 1, because that one hides a mystery that took 1,000 years to solve. A weapon so far ahead of its time that for decades scientists believed their instruments were malfunctioning. Let us begin. Number 7. The Sword of San Galgano, the Excalibur that truly exists. We all know the legend, a sword driven into stone that only the chosen one can pull out. Excalibur, King Arthur, pure medieval fantasy, right? Go to the Tuscany region in Italy and you will find a sword embedded in stone, real, and it is older than the King Arthur legend as we know it. In the year 1180, an Italian knight named Galgano Guidati had a vision. He was a violent soldier, a fighter, one of those who solved everything with the sword. According to the story, an angel asked him to abandon that life. Galgano laughed. He said that leaving weapons behind was as impossible as cutting stone with his sword. And to mock it, he raised his blade and drove it against the rock. The sword went in. Galgano spent the rest of his life as a hermit beside that stone. When he died, the church canonized him in record time, and they built a round chapel over the sword. And there it remained, with the hilt protruding in the shape of a perfect cross, for more than 800 years. Of course, historians assumed the obvious, that it was a fraud, that some medieval monks drove a fake sword in to attract pilgrims and donations. The church, in the Middle Ages, manufactured miracles to fill the coffers. Case closed. Until, in 2001, a team of metallurgists analyzed the blade for real. And what they found did not fit the fraud theory. The composition of the metal was from the 12th century, the exact era of Galgano. The construction techniques matched weapons from that period, and the rock around the base showed no signs of having been drilled or cut from above. The stone had naturally closed around the metal over centuries. Here I am being honest with you. Not everything is settled. There are still debates about some details, and no one can confirm the supernatural part of the story, obviously. But the sword is as old as the legend says. It is where the legend says, and there is no evidence of fraud. The Excalibur of the tales remains a myth, but a real sword, driven into stone more than 800 years ago. It is waiting for you on a hill in Tuscany. Number 6. Greek fire, the weapon whose secret was lost forever. Imagine a fire that burns on water, that does not go out even if you throw it into the sea, that sticks to wood, to sails, to skin, and keeps burning beneath the waves. Sounds like magic, like myth, like something impossible. And yet for centuries, it was the most feared weapon in the Mediterranean. They called it Greek fire, and it was completely real. In the year 672, the Byzantine Empire had its back against the wall. An enemy fleet was besieging Constantinople, its capital. And then the Byzantines unleashed a weapon no one had seen before. From tubes mounted on the prow of their ships, they launched a jet of liquid fire that set enemy vessels ablaze, and it burned on the surface of the sea. The fleets attacking Constantinople encountered an ocean in flames. Chroniclers of the time described it with horror, a fire that water did not extinguish, that seemed alive, that clung to everything it touched. For enemies, it was supernatural. For the Byzantines, it was their salvation. Greek fire defended Constantinople for centuries, and it is considered one of the reasons the empire survived so long. Here is what is fascinating, and the mystery that makes it unique on this list. The formula for Greek fire was a state secret, so jealously guarded that only a handful of people knew it, and it was passed from emperor to emperor. It was so well protected that when the empire finally fell, the exact recipe was lost. Forever. And here is the honesty up front. Today, no one knows with certainty how it was made. Chemists and historians have solid theories, probably a mixture based on crude oil, resins, and other compounds, launched under pressure and perhaps ignited at the mouth of the tube. But the precise formula, the exact ingredients, the real method, are an enigma that has not been fully reconstructed. I am not going to sell you an answer that science does not have. What is not disputed is that it existed, that it worked, and that it was so effective its name survived 1,000 years after its secret was extinguished. Greek fire was not a myth. It was a weapon so advanced that its formula died with the empire that guarded it, and still today we have not been able to recover it. Number 5. Aztec Death Whistles, the sound of terror. In 1999, some archaeologists were excavating an Aztec temple in Mexico City. Next to the skeleton of a sacrifice victim, between the bones of their hands, there were two small ceramic objects, shaped like skulls the size of a golf ball with a hole on top. They cataloged them as decorative funerary ornaments. They stored them. For years, no one paid them any attention. Until someone blew into one. The sound that came out froze everyone's blood in the room. It was not a whistle, it was not a flute note or anything resembling a musical sound. What came out of that little ceramic skull was, according to the researchers themselves, the closest thing to a human scream of absolute terror, to the sound of someone in the last moment of their life. One of the researchers described it as the closest to the sound of death he had ever heard come from an object. The Aztecs called them death whistles, and when researchers understood what they were, the old chronicles took on a chilling meaning. The Spanish conquistadors who survived the first battles against Aztec warriors described a sound before battle that they could not identify, a wall of howls that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and that terrified their horses. For centuries it was assumed to be exaggeration by traumatized soldiers. But later, acoustic researchers studied the whistles, and they discovered that they produce a sound at a frequency that the human brain is programmed to interpret as distress. It is not coincidence. Aztec artisans, over generations, had discovered exactly what frequencies trigger the deepest fear in the nervous system. They had manufactured psychological terror in an object that fits in one hand. Now imagine hundreds of warriors blowing at the same time, advancing toward you. The wall of sound the Spanish described was not exaggeration. It was a psychological weapon, designed with precision, functioning exactly as it should. The warrior who blew one of these was not making noise. He was giving voice to death. Number 4. The Roman Pilum, the javelin that broke on purpose. When you think of the Roman legions, you imagine the shields and the short sword. But Roman historians wrote about another weapon, the one that opened battles with a property that sounded almost magical. A heavy javelin called the pilum, which, when driven into an enemy shield, bent itself, becoming useless so they could not throw it back at you. For a long time, skeptics did not believe it. They said it was impossible for the Romans to mass-produce an iron point soft enough to bend, but hard enough to pierce armor. A javelin that bends on impact, they said, would be useless garbage in battle. Exaggeration to make Roman technology seem more advanced than it was. Until archaeologists began pulling real pilums from ancient battlefields all over Europe. And the truth was better than the myth. The pilum had no magical alloy. It was pure geometry, cold and brilliant engineering. The point hardened, pierced wood, leather, and iron with ease. But the long, very thin neck behind the point was made deliberately so slender that, the instant the point embedded, the physics of impact bent the metal under its own momentum. The result in combat? Brutal. The Roman soldier threw the pilum, the point cleanly pierced the enemy's shield, and instantly the neck bent, The enemy could not pull the twisted iron rod from his shield and could not throw the weapon back at you either. His only option was to throw the shield to the ground, becoming completely exposed, just as the Roman line closed distance with swords. Academics thought the bending pilum was a myth born from poor craftsmanship. Archaeologists proved it was a work of lethal engineering, a weapon designed to break itself, only to break the enemy. Number 3. Thor's hammer, the amulet that won a war of faith. For more than a century, archaeologists excavating Viking graves found the same object again and again. Next to the skeletons of warriors, and even in the graves of children, there were hundreds of small metal hammers, some rough, of iron, others beautiful, of silver and gold, hanging from chains, resting against the skin of the dead. For anyone, the answer was obvious. It was Mjolnir, Thor's hammer. But for decades, historians refused to accept it. They said it was romantic interpretation, that those pendants were ambiguous, that maybe they were abstract anchors or geometric jewelry without meaning, and that modern historians were hallucinating a myth about simple ornaments. Until 2014, on an island in Denmark, a pendant appeared that was different from all the others. The same hammer shape, but this one had a runic inscription carved into the metal. Researchers translated it, and it said, simply, "This is a hammer." 2 words. That was all it took. After a century of academic debate, a Viking craftsman had already written the answer on one of them. The skeptics were left with nothing. But the detail that changes everything is the historical moment. The production of these hammers coincides almost perfectly with the arrival of Christianity in Scandinavia. As missionaries advanced and crosses began to appear on Nordic necks, Thor's hammers did not disappear. On the contrary, they multiplied. They became more elaborate, more numerous, as if wearing one had become a conscious act of resistance. There are graves from that transition period that contain a cross and a hammer on the same body. People trapped between 2 worlds, unwilling to fully surrender either one. That was not superstition. It was identity. It was a people watching their gods being replaced in real time, clinging to the most powerful symbol they had left. Academics called it ambiguous jewelry. The Vikings called it protection. Number 2. The Goujian Sword, the blade that refused to die. In 1965, a team of archaeologists drained a flooded tomb in central China and pulled out a sword that should not have existed. Not because it was magical, but because of what it was doing. The blade was 2,500 years old. It had spent all that time submerged in water, sealed in a coffin, in a tomb that no one had opened in millennia. By every law of metallurgy, it should have been a rusted relic, crumbling into green dust. Bronze buried in water for 2 millennia is a death sentence for metal. Instead, one of the researchers reached in, pulled out the blade, and cut his finger. The sword was still sharp as a razor. After 2,500 years underground, it still cut. The blade was a deep, brilliant bronze, covered in a geometric pattern of diamonds so precise it looked machine-made, without a single rust stain. The inscription on the handle identified it. It was the personal sword of Goujian, king of Yue, one of the most famous and ruthless rulers in Chinese history. A man whose legend was so great that historians assumed the stories were exaggerated. But Goujian was real, and apparently so were the stories about his weapons. How did the sword survive? Scientists discovered that the bronze alloy contained a precise mixture of tin, copper, and sulfur compounds, which gave it natural resistance to oxidation. A formula so sophisticated that researchers still debate how craftsmen achieved it without modern chemistry. And the geometric pattern on the surface was not decorative. It reduced friction and improved corrosion resistance, all at once. Every detail of that sword, even those invisible to the naked eye, was designed to last. Today it sits in a museum in Hubei, behind reinforced glass, still sharp enough to cut. It has outlived the kingdom that made it, outlived the dynasty that buried it, outlived all the empires that rose and fell in the 25 centuries it spent underground. Number 1. The Ulfberht Swords, the steel that should not exist. Sometime in the 9th century, a sword appeared in Europe that should not have existed, not because it was enchanted, but because of the material it was made from. The blade was forged with steel so pure, so structurally perfect, that modern metallurgists who first analyzed it assumed their instruments were malfunctioning. They repeated the tests again and again, and it always came out the same. The steel of that sword should not have existed in Europe for another 800 years. The swords were marked with a name inlaid in iron letters along the blade: Ulfberht. Whoever Ulfberht was, his name became a brand, a guarantee. Between the 9th and 11th centuries, between 170 and 200 of these swords were recovered throughout Northern Europe, each with the same inscription. To understand why this matters so much, you have to know what European blacksmiths of the time were working with. Crude iron, full of impurities. The swords they produced were functional but fragile. They bent, they broke, and in the chaos of combat, a broken sword was a death sentence. The Ulfberts had almost no impurities. The carbon was distributed with a consistency that modern steel mills achieve with industrial processes. The blade was flexible to absorb impact without breaking, hard to maintain the edge, and light to move with the speed that crude swords could not match. In a world where the quality of your weapon was the difference between living and dying, an Ulfberht was not just better, it played in another category. The question that obsessed researchers for decades was just one: how? And the answer pointed east. The composition of Ulfberht steel matches crucible steel, a technique developed in Central Asia and the Middle East, which required temperatures that European furnaces of the time could not reach. Which means someone was importing that steel, or the knowledge to make it, through trade routes thousands of kilometers long. And here is the twist, an honest detail. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were sophisticated traders, with connections reaching from Scandinavia to the Caspian Sea. The Ulfberts are physical proof of that network. But there is something more. Fake copies from the period also appeared, with the name misspelled, made with inferior steel. Counterfeits of a brand. 1,000 years ago, people were already paying more for an authentic Ulfberht, and there were already those who imitated it. The legendary weapon was not magic. It was proof of a connected, commercial world, much more global than we ever imagined.